On February 23, 1996, inside San Quentin State Prison, history was made. For the first time in California's long and violent history of capital punishment, an execution would not be carried out by gas chamber or electric chair. Instead, a new, seemingly humane method was chosen: lethal injection. The man lying on the gurney that night was William George Bonin, a name already burned into the memory of Southern California. The press called him the Freeway Killer. His crimes were not random, nor were they brief. For years he hunted young men and boys along the sprawling highways of Los Angeles and Orange County. He lured them, violated them, and discarded their broken bodies on the side of the road like trash. To many, Bonin's execution was long overdue. To others, it marked a grim milestone: California's transition into a new era of state-sanctioned death. But beyond the sterile needles and chemicals lay the truth of his legacy. A trail of young lives erased, families shattered, and a chilling question of how one man could descend so far into violence. This is not just the story of William Bonin's death. It is the story of how a troubled boy became one of the state's most ruthless killers, and why his final moments were nothing compared to the terror he left behind. They called him the Freeway Killer. But that name, it doesn't even scratch the surface of what William Bonin really did. Picture this: late at night, a van pulled over on the side of a California highway. Inside, it's quiet, except for the sound of duct tape ripping and the muffled cries of a boy who won't live to see the morning. Bonin wasn't acting alone sometimes. He had friends who joined in. But make no mistake, he was the one who made it a routine, a game, a habit. Now, here's the part that still gets me. This man didn't just kill. He drove around looking for kids the way most people drive around looking for gas stations. He called it cruising, hunting, basically. And every time he spotted someone young, vulnerable, maybe just walking home, that was it. By the time police caught up with him, bodies were turning up like litter along the freeways. And the craziest part? He almost got away with it, because nobody thought to look for a man like Bonin, a war veteran, a so-called good neighbor. Someone who blended in while hiding urges most of us can't even imagine. This isn't just another story about a serial killer. It's about how one man used the highways we all trust, the open road, to turn Southern California into his personal hunting ground. Monsters aren't born in the dark, they're shaped there. And William Bonin's first years looked like something no kid should survive. He came into this world in January of 1947, in Connecticut, the middle boy of 3. His house wasn't a home, it was a battleground. His father drank hard, hit harder, and his mother, she wasn't much of a shield. Most days she just looked the other way. Picture being a kid where every footstep means a fist might follow. That was Bonin's normal. And when things got too rough, when he couldn't stay with his parents, they sent him to his grandfather. Now, you'd think maybe that would be better, right? Someone to protect him. But no. That's where the real damage started. His grandfather didn't just watch him, he touched him. He taught him twisted things no child should ever learn. And here's the part that's hard to swallow. Bonin didn't tell anyone. He kept it inside, like poison spreading through him, shaping how he saw power, control, and intimacy. At school he wasn't the loud troublemaker, he was the quiet kid, withdrawn. Teachers noticed he was slow to catch on. Other kids picked on him, and he took it. But behind those blank stares, something was building. He learned early that the world was cruel, and if you wanted to survive, sometimes you had to be cruel too. By his teens, you could already see the cracks. He started small, stealing cars, lying, pushing limits. At 15, he got caught, and that was his ticket into the system. They sent him to a juvenile detention center, and here's where the cycle repeated itself. He was preyed on by older boys, but before long he started preying on the weaker ones himself. That's the scary part. Bonin was learning both sides of abuse, victim and predator. Imagine that mix. A boy with no safe home, no boundaries, and no one telling him enough. Every bad hand life dealt him just made him colder. By the time he was a teenager, William Bonin wasn't just another troubled kid. He was someone who had already decided that hurting others was part of survival. And that That was just the beginning. Then came Vietnam. Some men came back shattered. Bonin came back colder. In 1965, at just 18 years old, William Bonin signed up for the Air Force. Maybe he thought the structure would fix him. Maybe he thought war was a way out. Or maybe, deep down, he knew a place built on violence was the only place he'd ever fit. He became an aerial gunner, sitting in the belly of planes raining fire over jungles. Imagine that, day after day, watching people die from a distance. Most soldiers cracked under that pressure. Bonin? He didn't flinch. In fact, some said he was fearless, reckless, like he didn't care if he made it back. And that's the part that sticks, because war didn't scar him the way it scarred others. It carved something out of him. Piece by piece, empathy disappeared. He came home with a medal for good conduct, like some kind of hero. But what nobody saw was that the war had fed his worst instincts. Killing no longer meant anything. When his plane landed back in the States, Bonin didn't bring back souvenirs. He brought back numbness. That dead-eyed calm you only see in people who've stopped seeing others as human. And once you carry that, you can't just switch it off. Reintegration? Impossible. He wasn't interested in settling down, holding a job, or building a family. The urges he'd been fighting since childhood, those twisted lessons about control and power, they weren't gone. They were sharper, stronger. And here's where it gets darker. Instead of looking for help, instead of trying to fight what was inside him, Bonin leaned into it. War had given him a taste of detachment. Now he knew exactly what it felt like to cause pain and feel nothing. That's a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. By the late 60s, William Bonin wasn't just another veteran trying to move on with life. He was a man who had lost whatever thin thread of empathy he had left. A soldier without a soul carrying home a war that would never end, at least not for the boys who'd soon cross his path. By the late 60s, the writing was already on the wall, and everyone ignored it. They thought William Bonin was just another troubled young man who needed guidance. But the truth was uglier. He wasn't just broken, he was dangerous. He was 21 years old when police caught him luring young boys, then assaulting them. Not once, not twice, but again and again. This wasn't curiosity, it was compulsion. The courts didn't know what to do with him, so they sent him to a psychiatric hospital. And here's where it gets chilling. The doctors studied him, diagnosed him. Their reports weren't vague. They said he was a threat to society. They said he was likely to reoffend. In plain words, if you let this man out, he will hurt again. And yet, he was released. Bonin walked free. And what did he do with that freedom? He proved them right. Over and over. He was arrested again in the early 70s, this time for picking up teenage boys, tying them, assaulting them. He was given parole. He violated parole. They gave him another chance, then another. The system treated his violence like paperwork. He'd serve time, make promises, and slip back onto the streets. Every red flag waved. Every warning was written down. Still, doors kept opening for him. This is the part that stings the most. The signs were all there, clear, undeniable. But the people in charge let him slip through. And every time they did, William Bonin sharpened his taste for control, his appetite for cruelty. The 1970s weren't about whether he'd strike again. They were about when. This is where the story shifts, from urges to a hunting routine. By 1979, William Bonin wasn't just a broken man with violent urges. He was a predator with a system, and like all predators, he found the perfect hunting ground, the California freeways. Picture it, his van rolling slow down the highways, sliding in and out of exit ramps. Inside, rope, tape, tools. Outside, the endless sprawl of Los Angeles suburbs, hitchhikers, runaways, kids trying to escape bad homes, or just teens looking for adventure. All of them vulnerable. All of them easy to miss when they disappeared. Bonin knew exactly who to target, boys between 12 and 19. Young, trusting, desperate for a ride. He'd pull up, smile, offer a lift, sometimes wave a beer, or promise a safe place to crash. That's all it took. Once the van door shut, it was over. The pattern was chillingly consistent. He'd assault, torture, strangle, his hands, his tools, whatever he felt like using. Then he'd dump the bodies like trash, on freeway shoulders, in ditches, along quiet suburban stretches of asphalt. California highways became his dumping ground, and every corpse was a calling card the police somehow couldn't connect fast enough. And here's the part that makes your stomach twist. He wasn't always alone. Bonin had accomplices, other broken men who helped lure victims, hold them down, silence their screams. They weren't forced. They wanted in. They shared his hunger. Sometimes they watched. Sometimes they joined in. Sometimes they drove while Bonin worked in the back of the van. The evil multiplied. This wasn't a crime spree, it was an assembly line of death. And Bonin thrived on it. Each kill fed the next. Each body dumped was a dare to the cops. Catch me if you can. He became so confident, so mechanical that the violence felt routine, almost casual. He didn't bother hiding the bodies well. He didn't need to. By the time anyone found them, he was already hunting again. The press would later call him the Freeway Killer, a name that sounds almost cinematic until you realize what it really meant. Kids, real kids, pulled off the road, never making it home. Their families left wondering why the world didn't protect them. Between 1979 and 1980, Bonin's van was a death trap on wheels. Every freeway exit was an opportunity. The first body. In May of '79, the body of 14-year-old Thomas Lundgren turned up in Agora Hills, strangled, abused. His corpse left like discarded trash, sprawled in the brush. Detectives who stumbled across him didn't realize it yet, but this was the opening scene of a nightmare that would stretch across the state. Bonin's confidence grew. That first body wasn't just a victim. It was proof he could get away with it. He'd cruise late at night, circling off-ramps, gas stations, quiet suburban stretches. Teens looking for rides were the easiest. Hitchhikers were everywhere in the late '70s, and in California you could practically pick them like fruit. Bonin would roll down his window, smile, offer a lift. Sometimes he flashed beer, sometimes drugs, sometimes he just promised a place to crash. Once the van door slid shut, the game was over, and the pattern never changed. Assault, torture, strangulation, dump the body near a freeway, drive away before the sun rose, one after another. July 1979, Mark Shelton, just 17, disappeared on his way to a movie theater. His body was found the next day. August 1979, Marcus Grabs, a 17-year-old German exchange student, was found stabbed dozens of times, his body abandoned off Malibu Canyon. August again, 15-year-old Donald Hayden, last seen leaving Disneyland, turned up along a freeway shoulder. September 1979. David Murillo, only 17, snatched while riding his bike. The killings had rhythm now. Every few weeks another boy, another headline, another family shattered. And Bonin wasn't working solo. He had friends, accomplices who wanted in. Vernon Butts, a factory worker with a dark fascination for pain. Gregory Miley, barely out of his teens himself. They didn't just watch. They helped. They held boys down. They strangled alongside Bonin. Sometimes they even suggested victims. Imagine that. Murder as a team sport. By the end of '79, the police couldn't ignore it anymore. Bodies were piling up along the interstate. Same cause of death, same age range, same dump sites. They knew there was a serial killer on the loose. The press gave him a name, the Freeway Killer, and that was all Bonin needed to hear. A nickname, a spotlight, fame. He wasn't scared. He was excited. Because for him, this wasn't chaos. It was control. For once in his miserable life, he was the one holding the power. And every time he dumped another body, it was like leaving his signature behind. Think about it. You're driving down a California freeway in 1979. Sun setting, traffic's thinning, radios playing Fleetwood Mac. And just a few feet off the shoulder, in the brush, lies the body of a boy whose only mistake was trusting the wrong man. And Bonin. He's already circling the next exit, already looking for his next ride, already planning the next dump. Every week, another body showed up, and cops weren't connecting the dots fast enough. By 1980, William Bonin was no longer experimenting. He was in full swing. The van became his office, the freeway his hunting ground, and young boys his raw material. The killings were so frequent it was like clockwork. Police would find one body, barely process it, and another would appear. The horror wasn't slowing down, it was accelerating. The numbers grew. At least 21 confirmed murders. That's the official number. But insiders, investigators, even some of his accomplices whispered that the real count was higher. Much higher. Each victim fit the mold. Teenage boys, often hitchhikers or runaways, strangled, tortured, abandoned like debris. The press covered the discoveries, but the stories blurred together. And that was the problem. These cases stretched across counties into different jurisdictions. Los Angeles, Orange, Kern, separate police departments meant scattered investigations. There was no single task force yet, no central brain connecting the dots. So Bonin kept killing. And every day the system lagged, another boy vanished. The police struggled to catch up. Imagine being a cop in Los Angeles in 1980. Crime everywhere, resources stretched thin, bodies piling up. You've got one strangled teenager dumped by the freeway. That's tragic. But in the very next county over, another detective has his own strangled teenager. Neither of you picks up the phone to compare notes. Not yet. The murders didn't look like a single case on paper. Some kids were stabbed, others were beaten. Some were dumped in different positions. Bonin and his accomplices didn't follow a neat, Hollywood-style pattern. They improvised. That chaos let him slip right through the cracks. Bonin's confidence. And Bonin, he noticed. Every time another body turned up and no one knocked on his door, his confidence swelled. He felt untouchable. He bragged to his so-called friends, told them straight up that killing had become routine, like clocking in for a shift. He once told a friend that strangling a boy gave him a high better than sex, and when the rush faded, he needed to do it again and again. He even joked about it. That's how casual it became. Life and death, reduced to punchlines in the hands of a man who'd completely hollowed out his soul. By mid-1980, Bonin's spree looked less like a series of crimes and more like a ritual. He'd cruise the freeway, spot a boy, pull him into the van, and the ending was always the same. Bodies weren't even hidden carefully anymore. Some were left in plain sight, dumped just yards from busy roads. That's how confident he'd become. He didn't care who found them. In fact, part of him wanted them to be found. Wanted the world to know a killer was out there without knowing who. News spread slowly, unevenly. Some communities whispered about a killer in a van. Parents warned their kids not to hitchhike. But this was California in the late 70s and early 80s. Hitchhiking wasn't just normal, it was a way of life. Teens still stuck out their thumbs. Bonin still pulled over, and the cycle never stopped. By now, Bonin wasn't just killing, he was daring. Daring the police to find him, daring the system to keep ignoring the growing pile of teenage bodies stacking up along California freeways. Every week that passed, the kill count rose. Every week that passed, Bonin's grip on reality slipped further, and while the police stumbled, Bonin was already planning his next pickup, his next ride, his next victim. The freeway killer wasn't slowing down, he was accelerating, and the clock was running out. It wasn't brilliant detective work that brought him down, it was his own mouth. By mid-1980, William Bonin had stacked up a trail of bodies so wide it stretched across counties. The cops were circling, the press was circling, but what finally did him in wasn't some genius clue or a sudden breakthrough in forensics. It was Bonin himself. Too confident, too loud, too reckless to keep quiet. Bonin had a habit of talking, to friends, to accomplices, to anyone who would listen. He'd boast about what he was doing, drop sick little details about how many kids he'd strangled, even joke about how easy it was to dump bodies along the freeway. Most killers keep secrets. Bonin practically handed his out. And it was only a matter of time before someone took him seriously. By 1980, the murders had reached a tipping point. Different police departments started comparing notes. Too many boys, too many freeways, too many bodies strangled and left like garbage. The nickname Freeway Killer was now locked in, and while detectives didn't yet know his name, They knew the profile: a man in a van, cruising the highways, picking up hitchhikers. The net was finally starting to tighten. The real break came when one of Bonin's so-called friends couldn't keep carrying the weight. Some of the very men who once joined him, Gregory Miley, James Monroe, Vernon Butts, started spilling pieces of the truth. They bragged too, whispered too, and eventually the cops had enough to point their eyes directly at Bonin. It wasn't police brilliance, it was loose lips. So they set a trap. In June 1980, police launched a stakeout outside Bonin's house. They knew the pattern now, late nights cruising the freeways looking for boys. They watched as he pulled out in his van, followed as he circled. And then, the moment they'd been waiting for, he tried to lure another boy inside. But this time it wasn't going to end the way he wanted. Officers moved in, catching him in the act before the door could even shut. What they found was worse than they'd imagined. The van wasn't just a vehicle. It was a mobile torture chamber: ropes, knives, tape, a crowbar. Tools meant not for travel but for control, for cruelty. Every item was proof that this wasn't random. This was premeditated. This was a man who lived to kill. For detectives who'd been staring at photos of broken teenage bodies for months, seeing the inside of that van was the final confirmation. They had their freeway killer. That night, William Bonin wasn't just another suspect. He was the name attached to the fear that had haunted California's highways for more than a year. Parents who warned their kids not to hitchhike. Teenagers who thought they'd be safe just catching a ride. Families who buried their sons with no answers. All of it pointed to him. And now, finally, he was off the road. Catching Bonin was only half the battle. The trial was coming, and with it, stories so disturbing they would stain California courtrooms for years. And while Bonin sat in custody, smirking, confident, maybe even amused, detectives were piecing together just how many lives he had taken. The Freeway Killer's van was parked for good, but the nightmare he left behind, that was only beginning to unfold. Courtrooms are built for justice, but when Bonin walked in, what people wanted was revenge. When William Bonin was dragged off the freeway and into custody, California thought the nightmare was over. But the trial showed something even worse, just how wide his shadow had stretched and how many lives he'd left shattered. This wasn't a single trial in a single courtroom. Bonin's crimes spanned multiple counties: Los Angeles, Orange, Kern. That meant multiple charges, multiple prosecutors, and a mountain of evidence. Each body was a case of its own, each set of grieving parents brought into the spotlight again. He wasn't just facing one murder charge, he was staring down a stack of them, heavy enough to bury him. The prosecution had a weapon even stronger than evidence: Bonin's own accomplices, Vernon Butts, Gregory Miley, James Monroe. Men who once rode in the van, who once held the rope, now pointed their fingers at Bonin. In chilling detail they described the van rides, the attacks, the stranglings. One after another, they painted the same picture. Bonin was the ringleader. Bonin was the one who pushed it further, who couldn't stop, who needed to kill. And the jury listened. Uncomfortable, horrified, but glued to every word. Then came the hardest part: the victims' families. Mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters. People who would never forget the night their child didn't come home. People who had to identify their sons from morgue photos, who sat through testimony about what had been done to their loved ones. Some couldn't hold back tears. Some shook with rage. Some stared at Bonin and begged to know why. And Bonin, he barely flinched. Sometimes he smirked. Sometimes he whispered to his lawyer. But he never gave the families the answer they craved. By the time the jury deliberated, the evidence was overwhelming. Bonin's van, the accomplice's testimony, the sheer number of bodies, there was no way around it. In 1982, William Bonin was convicted of multiple murders. The sentence was clear: death. The jury didn't hesitate. They didn't want rehabilitation. They didn't even want life in prison. They wanted him gone. The courtroom didn't feel like a space for justice anymore. It felt like a reckoning. The families wanted closure, but what they really wanted was for Bonin to pay with his life. And California agreed. Death row was waiting. Here's the part that stuck with everyone. While being sentenced to die, Bonin didn't collapse. He didn't beg. He didn't even act surprised. He stayed calm, almost too calm, as if he had expected it all along, as if the idea of lethal injection didn't bother him. Maybe it was arrogance. Maybe it was emptiness. Maybe it was both. The trial stripped away the mystery. No more rumors about a nameless predator in a van. No more whispers about the Freeway Killer. Now it had a face, a name. William Bonin. And with that name came the full truth. At least 21 young boys murdered. Countless families scarred forever. And a killer who had admitted, even boasted, that he couldn't stop himself. Bonin left the courtroom in chains, sentenced to die. But he wouldn't meet the needle for another decade. And in those years he would keep talking, keep smirking, keep manipulating, like a man who knew his story wasn't over yet. For 14 years Bonin sat on death row. He wasn't quiet, he wrote, he painted, he even gave interviews. After the trial, William Bonin was shipped off to San Quentin State Prison. For most people, death row is the end of the line, a place to wither in silence, waiting for the state to flip the switch. But Bonin? He treated it like an extended stage. The spotlight hadn't dimmed. He was still the Freeway Killer, and he seemed determined to remind people of it. San Quentin wasn't new to hosting killers. Charles Manson was there. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, would join later. Bonin was just another name in a long list of California's worst. But unlike some who faded into obscurity, Bonin leaned into his identity. He wrote letters. He painted. He spent his days behind bars acting like the world was still listening. And sometimes it was. Reporters, criminologists, even curious fans reached out, and Bonin answered. What shocked people wasn't just his crimes, it was how casually he talked about them. Bonin didn't spend his death row years apologizing or searching for redemption. He made it clear he felt no guilt. In one interview he admitted, flat out, killing became easy. As if he was describing a habit, not a horror. For the families of his victims, that was salt in the wound. They had waited years, decades even, for justice. But Bonin wasn't tormented by what he had done. He was comfortable, calm, almost smug. And that's the cruelty of the system. Sentenced to death in 1982, but he didn't die until 1996. 14 long years where families of murdered boys had to live with the knowledge that the man who destroyed their lives was still breathing, still talking, still painting pictures behind bars. Some families wrote angry letters. Others gave interviews, begging the state to carry out the sentence. Every parole denial, every appeal, every delay dragged the pain out longer. For the parents who had buried their children back in 79 and 80, it felt like the justice system was protecting Bonin more than them. In Bonin's own words, when asked why he killed, Bonin's responses were chillingly casual. It became my way of life. I couldn't stop. If they hadn't caught me, I would still be killing today. There was no apology in his tone, no attempt to soften it. He said it like a man describing what he had for breakfast, and that's what made him so terrifying. It wasn't just the crimes, it was the complete absence of anything human behind them. For the families, every quote was like losing their children all over again. Every time his words hit a newspaper, it reopened wounds. While they lived with empty bedrooms, with birthdays that would never be celebrated, Bonin was in San Quentin, making art, giving interviews and explaining without shame why he'd strangled their sons. By the mid-1990s, the appeals had run dry. The families knew the end was finally approaching. Lethal injection had replaced the gas chamber in California, and William Bonin was scheduled to be one of the first to die by the needle. For some, it felt like justice. For others, it felt far too late. 14 years of waiting. 14 years of headlines. 14 years of Bonin breathing while their sons were buried, and now at last the countdown had begun. At San Quentin, death row wakes up early on execution days. On February 23, 1996, the prison stirred with an unusual tension. For the first time in California's history, the state wasn't going to use cyanide gas. It was going to test its new lethal injection protocol. And William George Bonin, the Freeway Killer, was the man chosen to be the first. Inside the walls, the atmosphere was sterile but charged. Guards rehearsed their movements. Reporters lined up outside the gates. News vans idled with their satellite dishes pointed to the sky. For victims' families who had waited 16 years for this day, the countdown felt surreal. This wasn't just another execution. It was an event. California had fought for years over its death penalty process. Would lethal injection be more humane? Would it work smoothly? Every major network sent crews. Journalists scrambled for interviews with victims' families and legal experts. Even international press showed up, curious to see America's most populous state make the switch from gas to needle. For a brief moment, Bonin was back at the center of a spectacle. But this time it wasn't a trial. It was the end. The night before, Bonin was served what would become his last meal: 2 large pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 pints of ice cream, and 18 Coca-Colas. He ate. He joked with guards. He showed no sign of remorse. When asked for a final statement, Bonin said, "I would suggest that when a person has been convicted as guilty and sentenced to death, that if they desire to have a death sentence carried out, that it be done without a lot of legal wrangling. Prolonged legal wrangling simply prolongs the suffering of the victims' families. No apology. No, I'm sorry. Just a man giving the state a piece of advice on efficiency." At 12:01 a.m., Bonin was led into the newly outfitted execution chamber. He was strapped to a padded gurney. Intravenous lines were inserted into his arms. The room was cold, clinical, almost like a hospital, except for the witnesses seated behind the glass. Among them were family members of several boys he had murdered. They watched silently as the drugs began to flow. Sodium thiopental to knock him out, pancuronium bromide to paralyze him, potassium chloride to stop his heart. It took less than 15 minutes. By 12:13 a.m., William George Bonin, 49 years old, was pronounced dead. Some family members wept quietly. Others stared at the gurney with blank faces, emotions too complicated for words. A few expressed relief to reporters afterward. "It's over. We can breathe again." But many said the same thing. It didn't bring their children back. It didn't erase the nightmares. Closure was too small a word. For California, it was history. For the families, it was just another chapter in a lifelong grief. The next morning's papers splashed the headlines: "California executes Freeway Killer, first by lethal injection." Editorials debated the ethics, but one fact remained. Bonin had become a grim footnote in state history, both as a mass murderer and as a test case for a new way to kill. For the families of the 21 boys whose lives he stole February 23, 1996, wasn't a triumph. It was simply the end of a waiting game they never wanted to play. Highways are supposed to mean freedom, but after Bonin in Southern California, they meant something else: fear. For most people, a freeway is just asphalt, a way to get to work, the beach, or home. But for families in Southern California during the late 70s and early 80s, freeways carried a new, suffocating meaning. They were hunting grounds. William Bonin turned those stretches of road into his personal graveyard, and for years, parents couldn't let their kids hitchhike, couldn't trust the simple act of accepting a ride. Even after his execution, the phrase "Freeway Killer" never lost its sting. It wasn't just Bonin's name attached to it. A few other predators were active in that era, muddying the waters. But Bonin was the one who owned it. He perfected it, and every teenager in that time paid for it in paranoia. Bonin wasn't a genius criminal. He wasn't even that careful. What made him dangerous was how many times the system handed him another chance. Psychiatrists labeled him likely to reoffend. They were right. Parole officers flagged him. Judges saw his record. He racked up warnings like parking tickets, and yet the doors kept opening. His case became a harsh lesson for California's justice system. After Bonin, parole boards tightened restrictions for violent sex offenders. Supervision grew stricter. Background checks became sharper. In other words, the system tried to patch the holes, but only after too many boys had already been thrown through them. For the families, closure was never real. How do you close the wound of a child tortured and strangled, then dumped by a highway like trash? Some parents became activists pushing for stricter sentencing laws. Others withdrew into private grief, never speaking about it again. And some lived long enough to see Bonin die in 1996, but admitted afterward that watching him take his last breath didn't undo the nightmares. Their children's names never carried as far as his. That's the cruel irony of cases like this. The killer becomes infamous, while the victims are left as a footnote. In death, Bonin left behind more than just newspaper clippings. He left a scar. His name is tied forever to California's darkest chapter of freeway violence. Even now, if you drive the 405 or the 5 at night and think about those boys dumped like garbage along the shoulder, the shadow of the Freeway Killer creeps in. That's Bonin's legacy. Not his art on death row. Not his interviews. Not his so-called confessions. His legacy is fear. Fear carved into the freeways of California, into the parents who lost sons, into the law books reshaped by his crimes. Highways are supposed to mean freedom. But for California, thanks to William George Bonin, they will always carry the memory of a predator who turned open road into open season,